the most important thing about an evening like this, I guess that I am the Kevin Bacon of this crew. But the truth of the matter is that looking around, and almost everyone here I know, and that's amazing that you cared that much to come for that. But the truth is, this is a community of the best people that have chosen the best jobs, the best ways to live their life. We've got teachers out here, we've got scientists out here, we've got healthcare providers out here, we've got creatives out here, and these are the best jobs. These are the jobs that change the world, and y'all have chosen to be a part of that. And what's so awesome about that and the room that's this full room right here now is the kind of the love and the support and the caring that everybody in this room gives everybody else in this room all the time to make this community stronger. And that's what matters. And this family that we have here just blows my mind. Isn't it great? And y'all know that about yourselves. So I want to mention for a minute this remarkable bookstore. Some of y'all haven't been here before and haven't had a chance to have a chance to be a part of this bookstore, but once upon a time, not too long ago, this bookstore was a really nice jewel box cottage over near Libby, and wonderful place there. They were willing to give me a reading for my first novel before COVID, and it was a wonderful opportunity to chat there. They've moved to this beautiful spot here and turned this into even a more beautiful, larger bookstore. But what's great about this bookstore, there's no other bookstore like it in Richmond, and I know every bookstore in Richmond. This is the most community-focused, community-driven, community-caring, let's all get together and love books bookstore in the city. There's an event here 3 or 4 times a week. There's all kinds of fun things that they do in addition to readings. The Bridgerton Teas, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Children's activities. Y'all are amazing, and I just hope this bookstore becomes the hottest ticket in Virginia. If you get a chance, follow their Facebook page and look at the readings that they post, because Virginia has some of the great historians and the great fiction writers and the great poets in the whole country, and they all come here and they sit right over here, and you can sit right where you're sitting now and have them talk to you and learn about this amazing stuff that they're doing, and it's free. So please join in that. Of course, I would love it if you guys bought a book of mine, but buy a piece of chocolate from them, buy a book on the shelves, do something. If not tonight, some other time, because this is Richmond's bookstore, and the fact that they let me do this is a sign of it. So thank you guys. Okay, a few more things I want to chat about. This book took about 3 years to write, a lot of research, and I can talk a little bit about that for a minute, but I wanted to comment. There are some people in this room that took part in helping this book happen, and I just wanted to thank those of you that knew about this while it was happening, chipped in, told me fix this, fix that, and helped it happen. And so just a few people I want to comment on for a minute. So Age Before Beauty, Katie.
Pearls before swine.
So, this is Katie Bunger. If you haven't met her, she's irrepressible. She's she's wide open, and she is a very well-known mystery writer. She's written 3 series of mystery novels over the course of the last, I'm not going to say how many years, and these are the kinds of novels that don't include bloody murders that happen directly on the page. So you can actually read them and go to sleep at night once you finish reading. And they're witty, they're fun, they're chock full of Southern humor and Southern understanding of food and culture that very few mystery writers can do. So the name is Katie Munger, and I hope you'll check her out sometime. What Katie did for me was, in the very beginning, the first novel I wrote, I went down to her house in Durham, North Carolina, and she said, sit down at the computer, I'm going to teach you how to format a book. And we had champagne, and I sat down and formatted my novel. And she taught me how to get it going and get it published and all that. And every step of the way since then, every email, every text is on point. She knows everything there is to know about writing and publishing, and she's changed things for me. So thank you, And I want to mention too, if you haven't met my brother from another mother, Paul Whitcover, he's the fellow with the mask on over here. He always wears it. He wore it before COVID.
Who is that masked man?
If you were to take the mask off, what you would see is a guy who is the spitting image of the 1980s version of Clint Eastwood. I'm telling you, Kim, wait till you see him. It's going to be fun. It's amazing. And you're going to look like Clint Eastwood does now someday.
Yeah.
And hopefully not with the same politics. But anyway, so Paul and I have known each other forever as well. And once upon a time, we used to spend Septembers at his beach house in Delaware, his family beach house in Delaware, and we would just sit and write all month. And that was really, for me, the beginning of being a serious kind of writer, thinking myself as a serious writer. Paul is a very serious writer and has written a long series of speculative fiction novels, all of which are amazing. If you get a chance to get, I don't think that it's in this bookshop, unfortunately, but if you get a chance to get his new one, it's called Lincolnstein. And just briefly to do, I'll tell you what I think about it. So this will give you a flavor of the kind of amazing writing that Paul does. In this historical novel, Jim from Huckleberry Finn and Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and Frankenstein's brother happens to be passing through. And Frankenstein's brother transplants Jim's brain into Lincoln's body, so they're reborn together, and they set off through the South trying to reclaim Jim's family from the slavers. And you can imagine where you might go with that. What Paul imagines is mind-boggling and absolutely beautiful too. And what Paul has done is Paul reads everything I send him, even though he's the busiest guy in the world. He's the dean of literary studies, of creative writing at Southern New Hampshire University, in addition to writing all the time. But every time I send him something, he sends it back to me with incredibly sharp critiques. With this novel, which was much shorter than it is now, he wrote back to me and he said, the relationship between Chris Baker, the protagonist, and his love interest, his wife, you got to flesh it out, man. There's a lot more writing you could do there. Go back and fix that. And I took that to heart and did. And the book is so much better because it has a love story in it. And that's because of Paul. But that's the kind of stuff he does for everybody. So thanks, brother, from another mother. I'm going to do two more short ones and maybe one more after that, then I'll stop that, because I want to thank everybody in this room personally. So, my college mentor and tutor, Randy, is sitting right here in shorts. And he was my thesis advisor in college many years ago. And we've continued to be friends over the years, and we share our writing back and forth. Randy took a quick sabbatical down on a train yesterday to come down for this. He's in the middle of a book tour around the country for his new book. Randy's a philosopher, I guess you'd say, social philosopher. And
that's a stretch.
Yeah. And so his passion over the last many years has been the concept of improvisation and spontaneity and impulse. How our hearts and our minds battle each other and work together to get things done, and how we somehow trust our hearts more than our minds. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's not a bad thing. And I say that because a subtitle of his new book is "The Age of Trump," and because Trump is a champion improviser, he's off the cuff, and because he can stand and speak off the cuff, people really trust him. They really feel he's authentic.
He's
and
real.
He seems
Imagine.
real. Thank you. Yeah. so anyway, could you tell me the full title of the book?
Improv's Winging It, Improv's Power and Peril in the Time of Trump.
Winging It, Improv's Power and Peril in the Time of Trump. So if you're interested in that thinking, and this year would be a good time to read that book.
Mm-hmm.
What was his name again?
Randy
Randy
Fertel. I
Fertel.
don't think I said his name. Randy Fertel. Thank you. Thank you. My wife, Chris. Chris is always my first reader. When I started seriously writing again, she was just like, go do it, make it happen. We're gonna figure this out and get this done. And Chris reads more books than anybody in this room. Chris is reading a book on her Kindle while she's brushing her teeth in the morning. And so she knows everything about books. And the great thing about being married to someone who loves books, if I give her something to read, she doesn't have to say a word because I know the body language, whether I screw the pooch or not. And that's an incredible gift. You all know that's an incredible gift. So thank you. And the other thing, writing this book was, I don't know how it's going to be for you if you read it, but writing it some days were pretty bleak because I was basically in a basement abattoir with this guy who was chopping up bodies for all day long, trying to imagine what that felt like and was like. And Chris would come home from work and look at me, and she already knew it was going to be a difficult evening. So.
I'll leave you over there. I'm gonna go over here. I'm like, when are you gonna be done with this book?
Yeah, and my whole mood changed when it was over, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We were done.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's,
He got into it.
yeah. So that's part of tonight's celebration is I don't have to write this book anymore. But I hope you like it. Chris Simpner of the Poe Museum. Is he still here? Chris, are you still here? Yes, he's standing in the back there. He was so sweet to write a blurb for the book and came up with a thought that I hadn't thought about with this book. It's a creepy book because it's a creepy story. However, it's strangely endearing as well. There's something what will happen to you, I hope, when you're reading is what happened to me when I was learning about Chris Baker. You begin to root for him. At least that's what I did, and that's kind of odd because he's been treated as a monster in history in Richmond ever since he was alive. So let me talk a little bit about Chris Baker for just a minute. I first learned about him because VCU, which is where I was working as an occupational therapy professor, opened this thing called the Health Hub on Church Hill, and the idea was to help build support for the hospital in the black community of Church Hill. And in order to be a part of this, I went to an onboarding session where I was taught about what we were going to do. And one of the sessions was a 2-hour session talking about why the black community in Richmond is, let's say, has mixed feelings about the medical college. And why is that the case? Why would you not trust this wonderful hospital, right? That's the idea we talked about. And this creature, and it was described as a creature, Chris Baker was brought in as example number 1. Chris Baker was born enslaved in the Medical College of Virginia, which is now called the Egyptian Building, which is a landmark. We visited it this morning. You can check it out anytime. And he lived his entire life in the basement of the Egyptian Building. He lived far beyond slavery because he was born about 1850. And when he retired, in his age of late 60s, he readily said that he had robbed probably hundreds of graves across his career to provide what were described as dissection material for the anatomy classes for the medical students of the Medical College of Virginia. Which made him a monster, a ghoul. People called him a cannibal, all sorts of things, because, as you might imagine, he only robbed black graveyards. This is a black man robbing black graveyards in the service of white doctors, and he knew that if he ever robbed a white graveyard, he wouldn't make it out of the graveyard. But if he robbed a black graveyard, people looked the other way. And so in the black community, he was hunted, he was shot at many times, he was mobbed up, he was mugged on the street. The Egyptian building was surrounded and almost set on fire one time because of what was happening in that building. And Chris Baker really took the brunt of that. So this gentleman I wrote about was the man who did that work for them. And that's the story I set out to write, his life story. The research material on him is very slim. However, during his era, which is, let's see, Civil War era, he died in 1919 as an old man. There were 7 newspapers in the city of Richmond, sometimes more than that during that era. There were white newspapers, black newspapers, Jewish newspapers, all sorts of newspapers. And the city was going through probably the most traumatic time it's ever had. Civil War era and post-Civil War era, Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And these papers are amazing to read because people would get down in the dirt about it. Chris Baker was considered a character, and there are probably 20 front page articles about him that are profiles of him. And there are also short articles that talk about the times he was caught in the graveyard and put in jail. But mostly he was seen as this ghoulish, almost clownish, weird character that everybody knows about, so let's write another article about it. That's the primary source material, except for some ledgers at the medical college that talk about how much we paid him for a cadaver, how much we paid him monthly to do his work, that kind of stuff. The interesting thing about the newspaper articles is they contradict each other a lot. Some people say he was married, some people say he wasn't married, some people say his wife lived with him in the basement, some say she had her own house in Jackson Ward, some say he had 5 children, some say he had 1. All sorts of crazy stuff jumping in because people didn't know and they didn't bother to ask. They just made stuff up. So as a historical biographer, as a fictional biographer, there's a lot of room to fudge it and play with it. And what I tried so hard to do was tell the story as accurately as I could based on what seemed to be the most consistent stories across the papers and not get into some of the crazy stuff that people were talking about. So I believe that this story is as close as you're going to get to a non-fictionalized piece of fiction. But trust me, there's some fiction in there. I was making it up as I went along sometimes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the story that I decided to write. I want us to have a chance to have some wine and talk, so I'm going to read a little bit from the book and get along with it, okay?
Yep.
Okay.
I've got an alarm that may go off.
Okay. I probably need an alarm. So, I mentioned the newspaper articles that were written about Chris Baker, and I put one of them as an appendix at the end of the book to give you a flavor of what that looked like. And I want to just read a little bit of that article, so you can be back in his era, seeing how he was perceived by people. It was a newspaper called the Richmond Virginian, and Monday, May 7th, 1917. This is 2 years before he died, but he was already ill, and the subtitle was "Death Hovering Over Mysterious Chris." I'm going to quote exactly the way they write. "Old Negro, who has been in care of dissecting room of medical college half a century, is dying. Feared by all Negroes," in all caps. "Members of his race believed he bore a charmed life and thought he was a, in quotes, conjurer. Tried to kill him. Chris Baker has been more closely associated with death, perhaps, than any other man in the history of the South. Chris has been for about 50 years connected with the Medical College of Virginia as caretaker of the, quotes, stiffs, and is well known to every doctor who has come out of the school since the Civil War. For 25 years, he has been away from the college campus only once, it is said, since he is feared by other members of his race with a horror equal to the dread of a fatal disease. He has been shot at scores of times, and Negroes believe he bears a charmed life. They speak his name in whispers. Then there's a heading that's called Wielder of Black Magic. This grew and grew until rumors floated about concerning him and his practices. Children listened with wide open eyes to stories of how old Chris talked with the dead and knew the secrets of the grave and all the other dread but fascinating things that are wrapped in the same hush that goes with superstition. They feared him more and more until they held him in such awe that they would not pass him in the night. They feared so that they would not pass the college at night because he was there. It is said that he used to go visit the sick and would heal them by some mysterious power of his own. It was whispered too that by contrast, some magic words of his could blight as well as cure, and that to incur his enmity was to destroy all hopes of happiness and life. Long years ago, the dark rumor has it that Chris was used to visiting the cemeteries at night when the city was asleep. New-made graves would be upturned and the form of the silent sleeper there would be removed to the medical college to become the object of study and research. Isn't that a sweet way to say that? From these murmurings and reports, old Chris became an outcast among his race, as well as the most dreaded figure among them. The oldest physician in the city knows him well and can recite stories of his prowess that would fill pages in a book. And here's the quote that got me and made me go, I gotta do this. If all the stories about old Chris were to be told, his biography would fill more books than Lincoln's life or the history of the nation. Or at least this little book. So that's how he was seen in his time. What I'd like to do, I'd like you to read the book, but I would like to just set the setting for the book for you, because one of the things that goes into researching all this is imagining what downtown Richmond was like in the 1850s and 60s when he was a little boy, and boy was it a different city than it is now. So I want to just start by reading. Chris is 7 years old. It's Christmas Eve, and his mom's gone out to pick up a chicken to bring home because it's the one day of the year that his family, they're an enslaved family. His dad is a janitor at the Medical College of Virginia. His mom is a laundress for the Medical College of Virginia. Chris is born in the basement there, has lived there his whole 7 years, and he goes wandering out in the neighborhood, waiting for his mom to come home. So I'm just going to start you off there. It's the very first chapter in the book. Richmond, Virginia, 1857. His mother had gone out while he was sleeping, but he found a fatback biscuit she'd left for him under an overturned frying pan on the stove. He guessed that his father was upstairs, mopping the dissection lab or salting the front steps. He ate the biscuit absent-mindedly while wandering about the basement workshop, where a human torso, ribs splayed apart, lay dripping on a butcher block, a product of the previous day's anatomy exam. You have to get through these passages. The poor man's head stared up from a bucket, eye holes empty, a braid of hair from his last living day hanging over the lip. Cats lapped at the sticky floor. The boy pulled on his boots and wool seaman's coat, a hand-me-down from a medical student that his mother had cut down to size more or less, and went out the back door, not looking for her, just bored and seeking fresh air. Christmas Eve, unseasonably warm. The city, oddly quiet, too. All the usual clanging background noise of the foundries and factories by the river, stilled for the holiday. But along the steep hill, down to Shockoe Creek, those of you who live in Richmond know Shockoe Creek, all went on as usual. Last week's icy rain had flooded the Pauper's Field, upturning shallow graves. Below the Medical College of Virginia, the old Egyptian building, all the way down to Shockoe Creek, and uphill for about 400 yards or more is at least 22,000 black people were buried across a 50-year period that cemetery was open. And there's no sign of any of those graves today. There's been a monument placed at the top of Shako Cemetery that talks about that and the fact that this atrocity happened in the city of Richmond. But that's where Chris is playing, in the graveyard down the hill from the building. He crouched in the shadow of a pigsty on the slope and gazed across the swampy gorge, watching the animals feed. A motley pack of dogs fiercely defended their meal from a pair of pushy hogs, taking turns, he noticed, in facing off against their opponents, then tore off chunks of flesh that they choked down as if this were their last meal. This is a 7-year-old kid walking through this. Other hogs, unmolested, tugged out whole corpses by their legs and wasted no time in rooting at the rotten innards. Already the buzzards were up from their roost, living shadows circling, scoping out their prospects from the air. When the dogs were done, the birds teetered down one by one, formed a posse, not so different from the students gathered around a cadaver in the dissection theater, he thought, and proceeded to delicately pick at leftovers in the muck. Teams of rats scurried to and fro, thrilling when a red-tailed hawk swooped down and hauled one off screaming in its talons. It was early yet. The children he thought of as his friends had not come to do their daily scavenging for scraps here at the dumping ground. The slaves to market had not emerged yet from their stalls, chained together at the neck for their trotting exercise walk around the paddock. Most of us in Richmond understand this now, but also at the bottom of that hill were three streets that were several blocks long, going all the way to the river, that were the busiest slave markets in America. And he was born into that as well. He thought he'd wander that way, enjoying as he did the sullen songs they moaned as they marched. He unbuttoned his coat and picked along in the mud, enjoying his relative freedom and at ease in the routines of his neighborhood. Maybe he would find a shiny buckle or lapel pin upturned here, a Christmas gift for his mother. The entire book isn't quite that gruesome, but it does move along. The last piece I'm going to read before we have our cocktails is set in the middle of the Civil War. So at this point, he's still a child. His dad is still the janitor and also the guy who collects the cadavers and brings them back. So I'm going to talk about his dad, who's at the top of Shako Hill, looking down on the pauper's field, waiting for it to get dark enough for him to go do his job. And he's waiting for his son to come up the hill to help him. And this is the middle of the Civil War, 1863. Billy Baker's refuge on the far edge of, I'm sorry, I'm going to start somewhere else. Let me start here, because I just explained all that. Billy's boy Chris would be along. He'd be able to find the tall, bone-white tree, because Billy's has found a knot in a tree that he can crawl into and sit there at night waiting for the right time. And he sits there in the tree and rests for the only time he gets to rest all day. And that's where he is. Chris would be leading the two poor boys in this year's class. It was a damaged hall. They wouldn't know for sure until they got them back to the basement. But the gravedigger had said he left 3 Union soldier boys, shallow and stacked, easy pickings. Couldn't use the ambulance this time, sitting on starvation rations, so the Fesser doctor had sold off the dray horse for 3 bushels of corn. That's a fact that happened at the medical college. Chris would bring the barrow, the shovels, the tarp. The students would bring their promise to dig for a dime. Billy had his pistol and his will to use it. Now he just needed to wait under the tree as the older ones scattered gems across the purpling sky, and a lone barn owl awoke with a chortle to its own night of savage hunting. This was his favorite time. Always, out alone in the early spring air, nothing to do. Though waiting too was a side of the work. Work that was all day and night if he did it right. Out here for a few, he could let his eyelids shudder, hidden in the shelter of the tortured old tree, and see where his dreams might wander. And how they wandered too, but after all they had so much to work with. If he reached out his calloused hand and salt-bleached arm at arm's length, so his palm covered the college building that was his home on the next hill. Billy's whole nightmarish world fit in the stretch of his stubby fingers. At his pointer, the slave barns, a stone's throw down the hill, still thriving in the midst of war, where they dump the bodies sometimes not even dead yet, spasming from the dropsy or a cane to the head, out the back door with the slop and the offal and a wink, knowing old Billy would be along to drag them off before they stiffened. At his little finger, the far reach of his domain, lay the prison camp at Belle Isle, where any day you could pick among a dozen corpses so starved that lie dissolved them down to bone in an hour. A good haul if they were studying skeletons that week. Along the river and his palm, at the turning basin, it was the working ladies. If you needed a female, you could find them there. The mattress girls could throw down right on the canal. But of course, not a one would stoop so low as to reconnoiter with the ghoul of the city. He'd walk the river in the hours before dawn, and like as not, somebody got smart, somebody got cut or throttled, and nobody ever said a word. There at his ring finger lay the foundling hospital, where the mangled half-born were left to swaddle, if he could reach them before the dog packs that roamed the streets like a cavalry. Up close, the almshouse loomed, the poorhouse, filled to the brim these days with war wounded, the dead piled out back in an open shed, awaiting some kind of burial. At his middle finger stood the prison gallows, busier than ever now. The Capitol building hid there too, on the other side of his hand, its churchy white walls all proud and fancy. Congress, the Confederate Congress in their dandy suits, whipping the war along. That was the real killing floor. So I have finished what I was thinking of reading for it this evening.
Woo, that was beautiful.
We've got a really deep history in Richmond, and every time you pick up a book, you learn something, sometimes more horrific about it than you knew before. I just wanted. Every reading I've ever been to, there's like a Q&A session after the guy reads. So, are there any questions or comments, Randy?
So in the journalistic piece that you read first,
Yeah.
there was a little bit of a hint of voodoo. There was a word that jumped out at me.
They call him a conjurer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is that a tradition? I'm from New Orleans, so this jumps out at me.
Right.
It's West African influence here as well, or
So, Chris Baker most likely was from what we call Nigeria now. He's from the Igbo tribe, and so I've learned a lot about the Igbo religion. But there are also a lot of Igbo culture in New Orleans.
yeah, absolutely.
And there were
Senegambia.
there were witch doctors and witches and conjurers all over Virginia and all over the South. And one of the fascinating things, without getting too deep into all this, that I was learning about was, so the white guys are trying to get the black people to be Christians, because if you're a Christian, you can sacrifice your life here on earth in order to have heaven. And so you're enslaved and you have no control over your own life, but you're a Christian, so it's all good. But the African religions never went away. They just got built into the Christianity.
It's incredible.
And in the 1800s, it's phenomenal. Like for a long time, the First African Baptist Church, which is the great black church of the South, they wouldn't let a black minister be a minister there. They had a white minister because they were afraid a black minister would bring in the voodoo side. And finally, they got a black minister, and he did do some of that. But you had to, because that's what people believed. And so thinking that Chris Baker was a conjurer, I think was just a natural thing to think. And I built some of that into the book because something happens to Chris Baker that causes him to have a disorder of some kind that allows him to see spirits and to engage with them. And that's because of what they wrote about him, calling him a conjure man. So, thank you for asking me.
Thanks.
Yeah. Question, comment, thought? Caitlin?
I think I found it very interesting that you
pointed out how he grew up. And, you know, it doesn't even enter my mind the timing of it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, of course, what he saw, what he was around, that was his life.
Yeah.
So, absolutely, other people might call him a monster, but to him, it's just everything's matter of fact. And it's like, well, this is life and death. This is the way it is.
I'm glad you saw that because that's, I think, one of the things that started to win me over because somebody raised in that, exactly, in that environment, it was totally natural for him to be around dead people and chop them up and melt them down and throw them away. And it was just, it's what Daddy always taught me to do, right? Yeah, yeah, Corey.
I mean, I know I read recently down in Newport News, like CNU, they're trying to make amends for their involvement with the slave. Did all the universities, like you said, he was born as a slave to the school?
Right.
Did they all down here do that, or was that?
So there's only three medical schools in Virginia at his time. There's two. First, it was the Medical College of Virginia and UVA, and then the doctors' college for, originally it was called College for Doctors in Surgery, I think, which was the second hospital that eventually remolded with MCV. So for a time, there's three hospitals, and he was providing cadavers to all three of them. But UVA had a white professor who was, I can't remember his name now, but he was, the job is called being the demonstrator. Because you're demonstrating in the anatomy lab, which means you got to get the body to do the demonstrating. And so there was a white guy in Charlottesville that was in charge of getting bodies, but he would come to Richmond and get them from Chris Baker, because there were a lot more bodies in Richmond than were in Charlottesville. And there were black cemeteries in Charlottesville, but there were huge black cemeteries in Richmond. And you have, it's so morbid, but you have to get there the day they're buried. You can't let them lie there in the ground. You got to get them now. And that's the other piece of it. The timing is crazy. So, yeah. He was a busy man. Bill.
I hadn't really planned to say this. I'm just sitting here. I'm so moved by the story. This history is so important, I think, to us, because next summer we may not have books.
Oh.
The first thing to be burned were books. The second thing were people. And I'm so proud of our women who have organized to protect reproductive rights. And I don't know what men are doing. It seems to me that there is a slogan as powerful as that is "Don't burn our books." They're taking them away. There is a small Christian group which perceives America to be quite different. And I just wanted to say to a group who I expect to be somewhat sympathetic that we don't have much time left, I don't think. I think many of you of my age will remember a movie called Trial at Nuremberg, in which Burt Lancaster is the head of the German Supreme Court and a very highly respected jurist throughout the world until he took over the head of the court. And his lawyer is trying to protect him by saying they didn't know, they were shielded from that, they didn't understand what was going on. And Lancaster bursts out and he says, "We knew. We knew." And I just want to thank you for doing this book, because it tells us that there were times past, and I think we need to think of the future as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And if I could tag on to that for a moment, you may have noticed if you poked around the bookstore, there's a pride section here, and I'm so happy that this bookstore pushes hard for that, especially at Pride Month.
If you go to the Egyptian building in Richmond, can they show you the basement where he lived?
So, the Egyptian building is in addition to being a National Registered Landmark, it's part of the medical school that still teach there.
Okay.
So the rehab medicine department they have their offices there. So that building is open all week.
Even the basement?
Even the basement. If there's anybody here from the medical college, I'm sorry I said that. But yeah, so I recently went down there, and let me just tell you, I know people who work in that building. That building is haunted. and I don't go there, but I don't go there with the haunted idea. Except there's weird stuff going on in that building.
Let's
And
all meet and go on Halloween.
yeah, it should be a part of the haunted tours. I don't know if it is or not. It is. Yeah. And so if you go there during the week, you just open the door. I mean, it's an amazing building. You open the door, go downstairs, and if the janitor's not there, he won't chase you off. You can poke around. But you will. It's interesting. Yeah.
Well, you know they still do cadavers. in
Of
those
course.
schools.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I mean, this is something that's been going on since the beginning of medicine.
Absolutely, and will continue to go on always.
Yeah, so I
that's
mean,
right.
at MCV, they still are chopping up cadavers every day.
And I have a very personal connection to this, as Chris does too, because as an OT student, I dissected a cadaver.
Yeah, okay.
And the other, I have another personal connection. I was born at the Medical College of Virginia, and the third personal connection I have is I lectured in the Egyptian building. So there's lots of strange things that those of us who chopped up cadavers will understand about this book that others will wonder about. So,
I was born at medical college too, but St. Philip's during
course.
that time.
That's right.
1958. And so I'm considering possibly giving my body to science afterwards, so that way they legitimately have a black body to work with. And so interesting thing from the things that you read is that, so yeah, I heard that they robbed black graves, but it seems to me like there were several different places that they were able to get black bodies from. And of course, I think I read that you couldn't do that. It was illegal to mess with anything other than a black
it was
grave.
illegal to mess with black bodies, but they looked the other way.
Ah, so it was illegal. It's just that they turned out
There was
way.
a 10-year sentence if you got busted. And he got busted three times.
What about the white people with him?
They got busted too. I'm not going to say any more about it because it's illegal.
Spoiler alert.
Dear Ginger.
You probably covered this in the book, but my ghoulish imagination is now asking the question, once you get a cadaver, what do you do with it? Do you throw it over your shoulder and take it
You mean once you get him out of the grave?
Yeah.
Wheelbarrow.
I have described that in forensic detail. And that was the creepiest part of the research, was figuring out
Did you
how
try
that was
it,
done.
though?
Have I tried it? No, what I have done is I've walked from the medical college to the graveyards to see how long it took him to get there. So to get to Shaco Cemetery is like a 15-minute walk from the medical college, easy to do. And back in the day it was easier because Jackson Ward was intact. And you didn't have to cross the interstates to get to the graveyard. And then the cemeteries that are further out on Churchill and beyond, they take like an hour to get to walking. But he had an ambulance he could use with a horse to get back and forth. So, yeah. What's up, Mom?
Okay, so one of the ways that books are becoming more accessible to so many people are audiobooks. So, Tony, you're a reader. Who would you want to read your book?
The only reader that should ever read any book, Samuel Jackson. Right? You're right there. We should do that. Yeah.
If you could speak with Chris Baker today, what question or questions would you most want to ask him?
Did he have a wife?
Yes.
Did he really have a wife?
I want to answer that a little cockeyed. There's a short movie about the grave robbing in Richmond that Sean Utsi, the professor at VCU, has put together. I was hoping he would be able to sneak in here too. You can't hear me. Sean Utsi, who's the chair of the African American Studies Department at VCU, and also the studies, he's the head of one of the psychology department at VCU. He made a short movie about grave robbing in Richmond, that features Chris Baker, and it's on YouTube. And if you look at the back of the book, I mentioned it, and you can with the link to it. So the reason I bring that up is Sean said that here's this guy who was not educated in any way we understand, but probably knew more about human bodies and anatomy than the doctors that he worked with. And when I chatted with Sean about this, he said, you know, if Chris Baker was alive today, he'd be a neurosurgeon. And that really struck me. So I would give him a hug and say, wish you lived today.
Yeah. Huh. Was he ahead of the curve in sanitation? I mean, how did he manage to live as long as he did and not die from diseases from all the dead bodies?
Unbelievable, right?
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
unbelievable.
They weren't really up on it back at that point in. They were just starting to figure it out, right? I think during the Civil War or something.
Yeah, and tracking how body management changed between 1850 and 1919, that was an education as well, which I also gruesomely embedded in the book. So
Yeah, it is.
like yes, like how do you keep a body?
Oh, right. And did the bodies then went into the well?
So
Ooh.
good questions. So in 1994, when they were building the new building and those bodies were discovered in the well, 2 wells, and those bodies were not Chris Baker's doings. Those were the doings before his time. In Chris Baker's time, they put a pit in the basement of the building, and that's never been excavated. So there are hundreds probably of skeletons of some kind in that pit that's covered with concrete now. When you go visit, you won't be able to see the pit, but you'll be walking over it.
Okay, that's very haunting.
Frantic.
Can you feel it?
Yeah.
Can you feel it?
You could feel it in the air.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
Yeah, it's a creepy place. Yeah, Corey.
Was it accepted by the medical field at this point that the tone of the skin made no difference in what the body was? Like, did anyone object to, if I think I'm a superior race, which people did, right? In that era, did they object to?
Chapter 9.
Okay.
Wow.
So that in that era, there was no embalming of the body.
In the beginning, there wasn't an intervention. In the funeral homes, right around the post-Civil War era, people began to do embalming, serious embalming. I mean, there's been embalming ever since the Egyptians, because the mummies are embalmed. But they started doing the kind of embalming we do now in the 1870s and 80s in the funeral homes. And so Chris Baker learned how to do that as well, as to preserve a body. So it's the same thing a funeral home director would do today. Any other thought? Yeah, what's up, Steve?
So now that the Night Doctor of Richmond is in the books, no pun intended, will we be going to subsequent book launch parties?
God, I hope so, because this is awesome.
Yeah.
This is out of control. Like the only time this group of friends and family are ever going to be a part of my life is going to be a funeral.
Yeah.
So
Let's do another book launch.
that's what I'm hoping. You're not going? Okay, understood. Yeah.
Where did he live after when he was retired?
Yeah, so some of the newspapers say that he died in the Egyptian building basement.
Oh.
And some of them say that his wife had a house in Jackson Ward, and that's where he died. Because he stopped working at the medical college. And I chose to follow that path. But it's possible he lived and died in the same building.
Who took over the work?
By that time, there was no grave rob. By that time, there was a law passed that allowed bodies from all the prisons that, if you died in prison and weren't claimed, you went to the hospitals. If you died in an almshouse, in a poorhouse, and weren't claimed, you went to one of the 3 hospitals. So that still wasn't enough bodies. But what happened that was when about turn of the century, refrigerator trains came into being. Once there's refrigerator trains, you could get bodies from everywhere. And there was also refrigeration in the buildings, and there was formaldehyde, so you could store a body longer. And that meant the grave robbing could stop. And the janitor at the Egyptian building no longer had to do that role. So if he had lived longer, he would have never had to do that anymore. But he lived through it. Yeah, Paul.
Does anybody know what happened to his body after he
Yeah,
died? Do they know where he's buried?
Absolutely. Well, they know what cemetery he's buried in. But so when he died, he was such a well-known and beloved character by the white doctors that he'd served over the half century that he was there, that they paid for this for a formal funeral for him. And he's buried in a concrete coffin, so nobody can get his body, at Evergreen Cemetery, which is on the far east end.
The 9 miles.
Nobody knows where his grave is. And Evergreen Cemetery has been completely, it's horrible how it's been not taken care of. There's volunteers out there every week trying to basically bush hog the place to uncover the graves that have been there. And someday we're going to find Chris Baker's grave. But we haven't yet. He's out there.
Like Buddy Bolden at the Holt Cemetery.
Yeah, right. I want to go, take my, tools out there and try to find it, because it's in there somewhere.
So there may be a sequel.
The continuing life of Chris Baker.
Chris Baker.
Finding Chris Baker.
Finding Chris Baker. That's a good one. Anything else? Okay, please do me the great honor of sticking around long enough I made DoubleTree chocolate chip cookies, and those of you who are gluten-free, Chris made gluten-free brownies. We've got cheese and crackers and other things, and we've got prosecco, lemonade, water. And what I really would like to do is, if you get a chance, Zuzu has promised to take pictures, so if I could just take pictures with y'all before the night's over. And there's one other really important thing I'm going to ask you to do, and I should have asked you this at the beginning and I totally forgot. What I'd like you to do, if you will, is